Welcome to the Darkling Radio, where every shadow hides a secret and every story leaves a scar. Step into the dark, if you dare. Jared had always loved late-night walks, but tonight, as he followed Emily through the misty park, something felt wrong. The shadows seemed alive, stretching toward them, and a pale, grinning figure appeared at the edge of the fog. Neither of them could know that once the park had noticed them, it would never let them leave. I had always loved walking through the old city park at dusk. There was something soothing about the way the fading light filtered through the branches, the way shadows stretched lazily across the cracked paths. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, and it always seemed to wash away the tension of the day. That evening, though, as I stepped past the iron gates, a shiver ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the chill. The park felt off, quieter than usual, but not in a peaceful way. It was as if someone or something had swallowed the usual sounds. The distant hum of traffic, the faint laughter of children, even the occasional chirping of birds. There was nothing but silence, thick and heavy, pressing against my ears. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination. Maybe it was just the light fading faster than I realized, or perhaps I was tired and overthinking. I walked along the winding path that curved past the fountain, the water glinting silver in the fading sun. That's when I saw it. A figure crouched near the edge of the fountain, completely still. At first I thought it was a child playing, maybe hiding in a game of pretend, but even from a distance something about the figure was wrong. It didn't shift or move naturally. Its body seemed stiff, frozen in a pose that was almost deliberate, as if it had been waiting there for hours. My chest tightened, and I felt an inexplicable pull to look away, to hurry past it and leave the park immediately. But my eyes kept returning, drawn like magnets to the figure. Every time I glanced it felt slightly closer, though the path between us had not changed. My pulse quickened, each step heavier than the last. There was no wind, yet the leaves rustled as if whispering to me, and the shadows between the trees seemed to stretch, reaching toward me in silent, impossible ways. The lamplight flickered above me, casting short bursts of dim illumination across the path, and then, for a fleeting moment, I saw its face, blank, pale, like porcelain, with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. There was no emotion, no warmth, yet somehow the gaze pierced straight through me, making my stomach twist and my skin crawl. I blinked rapidly, hoping it was a trick of the light, a shadow shaped by my own fear. When the flicker ended and the lamp glowed steadily again, the figure was gone. My heart hammered against my ribs as I searched the area, scanning every tree, every bush. There was nothing. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it had been a person who had darted away when they saw me. Maybe it was a trick of my tired eyes. But deep down I knew that explanation didn't fit. There was an unnatural stillness to it, a presence that lingered in the air long after it vanished. My legs carried me forward automatically, though my mind screamed to turn back. Each step I took along the cracked path made the silence more oppressive. Even the fountain, which had always gurgled with soft, comforting water, seemed to mock me with its unnerving stillness. I hurried past the benches, past the overgrown flower beds that had long been neglected, and toward the exit. But as I reached the edge of the park, I had the unsettling sensation that I wasn't alone. The shadows behind me seemed to shift subtly, bending and twitching in ways that defied the light. Every now and then, I caught glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, tiny pale shapes flitting between trees, always vanishing when I tried to focus. By the time I reached the iron gates, my hands were trembling. I forced myself to walk quickly, refusing to look back, telling myself that once I left the park, the strange presence would disappear. But the moment I stepped onto the sidewalk, I realized the unease hadn't left me. The sensation of being watched clung to my skin, and I could feel it burrowing into my mind, persistent and patient. That night, in the quiet of my apartment, I tried to sleep. Every sound, the distant hum of traffic, the creak of my ceiling fan felt amplified, as if it were trying to tell me something. I closed my eyes, willing the images from the park to fade, but instead, I saw the pale face, blank and hollow, staring at me from the darkness of my bedroom, and then, faintly at first, I heard it. A soft scraping sound against the window. Deliberate, patient, like tiny claws tracing the glass. My heart nearly stopped. I told myself it must be a branch, the wind, anything. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever I had seen in the park that evening had followed me home. The next day I tried to convince myself that the previous evening had been nothing more than imagination. The memory of the pale, hollow-eyed figure and the strange silence still lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind, but I told myself it was just shadows playing tricks, exhaustion warping perception. Determined to prove that the park was safe, I returned in the afternoon when the sun was still high. Light spilled over the paths and glinted off the fountain, casting dancing patterns on the cracked stone. The park looked ordinary again, almost welcoming, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something I didn't fully understand. As I wandered along the winding path, my eyes caught something in the muddy ground near a cluster of trees. Small footprints, fresh and wet, pressed into the soil. At first I assumed they were made by a child, someone who had been running through the grass earlier, but the prints were peculiar, too small and thin, almost delicate, and they were perfectly symmetrical, as if someone or something had moved with deliberate precision. The prints twisted and turned in ways a child couldn't, curving around the roots and circling the trees in impossible loops. My stomach churned. I had no explanation for them, and the deeper I followed, the more unsettling it became. The footprints led me deeper into the park, past the fountain and toward a dense area where the trees grew close together and the grass had become wild. The sunlight struggled to break through the thick canopy, leaving patches of shadow that seemed to shift under my gaze. I noticed something else: more prints, almost identical to the first, moving in the opposite direction. They crisscrossed the first trail, creating a strange, deliberate pattern that made my chest tighten. It was as though something was not only walking through the park but also following itself, tracing its own path endlessly. I froze for a moment, my senses screaming at me to turn back. But the curiosity, the need to know what I was looking at, pulled me forward. The silence of the park was absolute now, thick and suffocating, as if the earth itself had swallowed all other sound. I could feel a weight pressing against my back, an invisible gaze that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. Every instinct told me to flee, but I couldn't move. Something in the shadows was watching me, patient, waiting. Then I saw a movement in the corner of my vision, subtle at first, like a flicker of light between the trees. I turned slowly, heart hammering. A figure crouched low behind a thick tree trunk. At first, I thought it was human, but the shape was wrong, too thin, too rigid. And then I saw the face, the same blank, pale visage I had seen the day before, eyes hollow and empty, staring at me with an expressionless intensity. But this time, the figure's lips stretched into a grin, wide and unnatural, impossibly long, as if the skin had been pulled and stitched into a permanent smirk. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to obey. I could only watch as it stood, rising smoothly, like it had always been part of the tree itself. The leaves rustled around it, though no wind stirred, and a strange, almost sweet metallic scent filled my nose. My mind screamed at me to leave, but every step backward felt like wading through invisible molasses. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a statue, an abandoned mannequin, something left as a cruel prank. But the way it moved, the way the shadows shifted around it was impossible to ignore the truth. This thing was alive, and it was aware of me. The figure took a slow, deliberate step closer, and I finally moved, tripping over a root as I fled. Behind me I could hear the soft crunch of leaves and the muted slap of footsteps that weren't my own, always keeping pace, always just behind. I didn't dare look back until I reached the edge of the park, gasping for breath, heart pounding so violently it hurt my chest. I scanned the path behind me. The park appeared empty once more, the footprints vanished, and the air was still as though nothing had happened. But as I walked home, I felt the sensation of being followed lingering like a shadow. My mind tried to argue with me, to reason that it was nothing, but deep down I knew better. Something in that park was watching, waiting, and it wasn't satisfied with just appearing once. I could feel its presence in the quiet corners of my apartment later that night, the same weightless, patient gaze, as if it had entered my mind along with me. And then I noticed it. A pale handprint, small and thin, smudged faintly on the fogged glass of my bathroom mirror, as if someone or something had been leaning close to watch me sleep. I didn't go back to the park for nearly a week. The memory of those hollow eyes and that impossible grin haunted me constantly, creeping into my thoughts even during the brightest parts of the day. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the figure had been nothing more than a trick of shadows and fear. Yet, despite my attempts at rationalizing, a sense of unease clung to me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Eventually, curiosity, or perhaps a compulsion I could not explain, pulled me back. I needed answers, or at least to see for myself that it hadn't been real. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun already low, casting long, uneven shadows across the paths. Fog had begun to curl through the park, thin at first but thickening with each step I took. The air smelled damp, earthy, and faintly metallic, like rusted iron mixed with decaying leaves. I tried to shake off the creeping dread, convincing myself that the park was simply old, neglected, and overgrown. But as I walked deeper in, past the fountain and toward the densest parts of the trees, I noticed signs of disturbance. The ground near the swing set was churned up, earth torn and scattered, as if someone or something had been digging. A shiver ran down my spine, and I knelt to examine the soil. Tiny scratch marks scored the dirt, jagged and frantic, forming shapes that made no sense, letters or numbers, or maybe symbols, but they felt wrong, alien. I felt my pulse quicken as I realized these marks weren't human. They were too small, too deliberate, each one a frantic imprint made by hands that couldn't possibly belong to someone my size. My stomach twisted, a mix of fear and fascination keeping me pinned to the ground. Then I saw it. Lying half buried among the scratches was a small doll, cracked and dirty, its porcelain skin chipped and worn. Its eyes caught the fading light in a way that made them seem almost alive. I leaned closer, and my stomach dropped. The eyes didn't just reflect the light, they reflected me. And behind me, in those mirror-like eyes, I thought I could see a shape crouched low, watching, waiting, almost blending with the shadows. I spun around violently. The park looked empty, just a fog rolling between the trees, the swings swaying slightly as though stirred by a breathless wind. My heart thumped violently, and every instinct screamed at me to run. I tried to focus on my exit, but something stopped me, an invisible force that made me step closer to the doll, compelled me to study it, even as fear coiled in my chest like a living thing. The reflection in its eyes seemed to change as I watched. The shape behind me grew taller, stretching, bending in ways that no human could, as if it existed partly in another dimension. The grin I had seen before flickered across a shadowed face, too wide, too perfect to be natural. And then, impossibly, I realized it was not the figure crouched in the shadows, it was inside the reflection itself, waiting, patient, aware of me in a way that chilled me to my core. I stumbled backward, my breath ragged, and the doll fell from the disturbed soil, landing with a soft, hollow thump. For a moment, everything seemed frozen, the fog motionless, the air still. Then a whisper of movement brushed past me, faint and deliberate. Something slid through the mist, skimming the ground just out of sight, following me silently. My panic surged. I didn't run at first. I couldn't. I could feel it, felt its eyes drilling into my back, the presence pressing on me from every direction. Yet when I turned, there was nothing. Finally, I bolted. My legs carried me blindly, tripping over roots, skidding through the loose soil, until I reached the path near the fountain. I dared a glance back. The doll lay in the dirt where I had dropped it, its eyes reflecting only the gray fog, but even as I looked, the shadow moved closer. I couldn't explain it. There was no figure visible, but I felt it, felt the patient approach, the certainty that it had been waiting for me all this time. When I finally escaped the park, gasping and shaking, the sensation of being watched lingered. That night, even in the supposed safety of my apartment, I felt it hovering just beyond sight. And then, faintly, I heard it, the soft scraping of small, deliberate footsteps circling my bedroom. Not the footsteps of a person, but something smaller, quicker, unrelenting. I couldn't see it, but I knew it had followed me. The doll's eyes, blank and mirrored, were still imprinted on my mind, reflecting a presence I could neither flee nor comprehend. I tried to avoid the park completely after that night, but it didn't matter. The memory of those hollow eyes and that impossible grin clung to me, invading every quiet moment. Even during the day, I would catch shadows moving where there should be none, reflections in mirrors that weren't mine, and the faint rhythmic scraping of tiny footsteps that seemed to follow me through my apartment. I told myself I was imagining things, that my mind had been pushed too far by fear, but deep down, I knew the truth. The park had marked me, and it wasn't finished. Days turned into nights filled with restless sleep and half-dreams. I would wake to the feeling of breath on my neck, the faint pressure of something unseen leaning over me. My apartment, once familiar and safe, had become alien. The shadows seemed thicker, moving on their own, stretching in ways that defied logic. I tried to distract myself with work, with television, with anything to occupy my mind, but it was always there just beyond the edge of my vision, watching, waiting. One evening, desperate for some kind of closure, I forced myself to return. The park was shrouded in fog, a gray, suffocating blanket that swallowed the lamplight and blurred the paths. The air was thick and heavy, damp with decay, carrying the faint metallic temp that had haunted me since the first encounter. Every tree seemed to lean toward me, their twisted branches reaching like fingers. Every rustle of leaves sounded like whispers, faint laughter, or the soft drag of something moving across the ground. My heart raced with every step, yet some part of me compelled me forward, a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity that I could not resist. As I walked deeper into the fog, I began to notice them dozens, then hundreds, of tiny figures emerging from the mist. They stood scattered across the grass, motionless, pale, faceless. Their blank eyes turned toward me, and I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. The figures didn't move at first, but the air around them seemed alive, vibrating with anticipation. I wanted to run, but my legs froze, rooted to the ground by terror. Then I saw it. The first figure I had seen, the one crouched by the fountain on that first evening, stepped forward. Not like a human walking, not slowly, not carefully. It rose as if it had always been part of the earth itself, emerging from the soil with a silent inevitability that made my stomach turn. The grin stretched across its face, impossibly wide, impossibly cruel. Behind it, the smaller figures began to shift, crawling across the grass like a wave of pale, featureless forms, flowing toward me in perfect synchronization. The air was thick with a metallic scent, and I realized, with a surge of panic, that the figures weren't just watching, they were approaching, patient but unstoppable. I tried to back away, but the ground beneath me seemed to pull at my feet. Every step felt heavier, as if the park itself were resisting my escape. The fog thickened, wrapping around me, hiding everything except the advancing figures. My mind screamed, urging me to run, but my body betrayed me. I could feel the presence of hundreds of unseen eyes boring into me from the shadows beyond the fog, waiting for the precise moment to strike. And then I saw movement in the reflection of a puddle nearby. My own face stared back at me, but it wasn't alone. Behind me, in the mirrored surface of the water, dozens of pale faces grinned, identical to the ones advancing through the mist. My chest tightened as I realized the horrifying truth. The figures were not just in the park, they had infiltrated me, my perception, my very being. Wherever I went, they would be there, patient and watching, feeding on my fear. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My vision blurred, and the fog seemed to swallow me whole. The tiny figures surrounded me now, crawling closer with deliberate patience. The air vibrated with their presence, a low, almost imperceptible hum that pressed against my skull. I stumbled, my hands clawing at the ground, but there was no escape. The park had claimed me, and I was trapped in its endless, suffocating fog. Somewhere in the distance, the fountain gurgled weakly, the swings creaked as if moved by unseen hands, and I knew, with a cold, sinking certainty, that I was not alone, not just here, not just now. The figures would follow me anywhere, patient, persistent, and eternal. The park had found me, and I would never leave its fog, its shadows, its endless, silent watches. I woke up in an unfamiliar coldness, my body stiff and trembling. The room, or whatever space I had awoken in, was gray and silent, the air thick with dampness and the same metallic temps I had smelled in the park. At first I thought I was still dreaming, but the pressure on my chest, the heaviness of the air, and the faint scraping of tiny feet told me otherwise. I tried to move, but my limbs felt heavy, as if the ground itself resisted my motion. And when my eyes adjusted, I realized with a jolt that I was no longer in my apartment, no longer on any familiar street. The park stretched endlessly around me, shrouded in fog and shadow, under a sky so gray it blocked out the sun entirely. The swings swayed slowly, though there was no wind. The fountain gurgled weakly, black water trickling down its cracked stones. The trees leaned inward, their twisted branches reaching like hands, and the paths that had once been familiar were now distorted, curling in impossible loops that led nowhere. My mind screamed at me to turn and run, but every step I tried to take felt drawn backward, pulled by some unseen force that tethered me to the park. The fog thickened with every move I made, obscuring the ground and hiding the shapes that waited just beyond sight. And then I saw them, hundreds of pale, faceless figures emerging from the mist, standing scattered across the grass, identical to the ones I had glimpsed before. Motionless at first, their blank eyes fixed on me, yet I could feel them pressing in, closer, patient, unrelenting. Panic clawed at my chest. My legs moved on their own, stumbling across the wet grass, yet every attempt to escape seemed futile. The figures were everywhere at once, surrounding me in a slow, deliberate, tightening circle. I fell to my knees, gasping, my hands clawing at the damp earth. The first figure I had ever seen, the crouched one by the fountain, stepped forward again. Its grin stretched impossibly wide, cruel and deliberate, and the smaller figures began moving as one, crawling and slithering toward me in a wave that seemed endless. I could hear the faint scraping of their tiny feet across the ground, a rhythm that echoed like a heartbeat syncopated with my own pounding pulse. The air around me vibrated, heavy with anticipation, and I realized with cold horror that I was trapped, entirely at the mercy of whatever force had claimed the park. I looked down at a puddle near my knees, and my reflection froze me in terror. My own face stared back at me, but it was not alone. Behind me, reflected in the water, were countless other faces, identical to the pale, hollow-eyed figures surrounding me. They grinned, stretching impossibly, and I felt the terrifying truth settle in. The figures had not just been part of the park, they had infiltrated me. My mind, my perception, my very being. There was no separating myself from them. Wherever I went, they would follow, patient and eternal. I scrambled to my feet, stumbling through the fog, desperate to find some exit, some way out of this endless, suffocating park. But every path twisted back on itself. Every landmark I thought I recognized, the fountain, the swings, the twisted trees, was warped, distorted, as if the park were alive and rearranging itself, playing with me. My chest heaved, my breaths ragged, my vision blurred with tears and fear. I screamed, but no sound came, swallowed by the oppressive silence that surrounded me. As I stumbled, I noticed something impossible. In the corner of my eye, a figure moved differently than the others, taller, more deliberate, stepping through the fog as if it controlled everything around it. I turned fully to see it, and my stomach dropped. The figure had my face, my own face, twisted into a grin I had never worn, staring back at me with hollow, merciless eyes. And behind it, shadows stretched and shifted, forming hundreds of versions of me, each one grinning, watching, waiting. I tried to run, but the ground swallowed my steps. The fog pressed in, suffocating, endless. The figures closed in, the scraping of tiny feet a steady, relentless rhythm. I realized then that I would never leave. The park had claimed me entirely. I was not a visitor. I was a part of it now. Somewhere in the gray fog, a swing creaked slowly. A reflection glimmered in a puddle, faintly, teasing my eyes. I froze. I knew someone was reading these words, someone who had walked the park paths, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that they were being watched too. The footprints would appear. The eyes would follow. The park never let anyone leave, not truly. And in the silence, as the fog pressed closer and the tiny feet scraped endlessly, I understood the final, horrifying truth. The park was patient, eternal, and it had already begun marking the next victim.